Good day and welcome to the 90th session of the Global Markets Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. The session is available in French and English as usual. And to access either of these languages, you would have to click on the globe icon on the bottom right side of your screen. We are also streaming live on the ACO Facebook page and on the ACA YouTube channel. And on the YouTube channel, you could also find a recording of all the 89 previous sessions. Be reminded that as the session goes on, you can ask your questions and leave comments in the discussion box below. I would like to say thank you to all the partners and sponsors that are making this webinar possible every 2 Wednesdays. Thank you to the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ Move Come Cashew Project, the Sustainable Nuts Initiative, and the Cashew Club. I am excited to remind you of the 19th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo. We are 20 days away from November 18th to 21st of this year in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, to discuss around the theme unlocking cashew investment opportunities for sustainable economic growth. And the good news is we are having the GME live in person at the conference. You may visit the ACA website to register now. Getting back to today's webinar, we are having a market update and a policy review with our cashew expert, Jim Fitzpatrick. Good morning, Jim.
Hi, Stella. Hi, everyone. Good morning to you. I can hear in your voice, Stella, you're quite excited about this upcoming event in Tanzania. I must say,
Oh, yes, I
I'm
am.
yeah, me too. I'm looking forward to it. Should be,
I just can't
should be a good
wait
few
to
days.
have the GME live with you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. We're putting together some ideas on what we're going to do, but I'm thinking we'll look forward, what's happening in the cashew sector. What might it look like 10 years from now? So that
Wow.
might be interesting, and I'm hoping we'll get a lot of people involved in the discussion. We've had similar events. We had, I think last time around, we had about 90 people crammed into a really small room. That was fun.
Yeah.
This time, well, I hope we'll have 90 people, but I hope they won't be crammed into a really small room. And I think it's going to be really good. But,
We are making sure to have a bigger room this time.
well, I'm not worried about the room. I know you're going to do that. I'm hoping we're going to get a lot of people into it. And whatever size it is, we're going to have some fun. What about
I
today?
just can't
Well,
wait.
yeah,
The
looking forward
floor
to
is
seeing you
yours,
there.
Jim.
Thank you, Stella. We're going to talk today about a range of topics. Going to have a look at the market situation. We'll have a look at production update, emphasis on the Southern Hemisphere, of course. And as Stella said, we're going to have a look at some of the policy and regulatory measures, some of the gossip around that, some of the strange events around policy right now, and some of the frustrations of so many stakeholders. So let's get started and we'll have a look at the market to begin. I'm looking at kind of interesting times, let's say, and interesting isn't always a good word when it comes to markets. Right now, what we're seeing a definitely positive progress on the Southern Hemisphere crops. Bit late, bit slow to come to market, of course, but positive progress. Really positive from India. I think demand for Diwali was really good for cashews. I think that's really positive sign, and it gives a lot of interesting ideas and thoughts for where India is going. If you were with us back in March, I talked to you about the Mewa India, the dried and nuts fruit event. And when I came back from that, I got the feeling that India was on the verge of a big move in terms of dried fruit and nut consumption. I'm still thinking that. I'm still thinking that's where we're going. And of course, India is the world's biggest consumer of cashew kernels. In the West, short term at least, buyers are hanging back on the sidelines, waiting to take their next tranche of forward cover. European and US buyers, they do buy forward. By now, most people will have set their budgets for next year. They'll be looking at the market for opportunity. They'll be looking for the market mostly to make sure they don't miss any big moves and make any major mistakes. So unless we got some negative news on the 2026 crop, they'll take their time, but they do have to move. They do have a calendar to work with. And if I were in that position, I too would be taking my time and waiting to see how things develop with the next crop. In Europe, good news on consumption. So we could describe the European market as relatively mature in terms of nuts and dried fruit. And what we're seeing is great growth in cashew kernels imports, 7.8% up 2025 versus 2024. That's excellent growth by any measurement. Last year was also a very good year. From an African point of view, the share is slightly up by about 10%. It's up to 22% of the imports between January and August. We are probably looking for that to continue. More cashews coming in, slightly less percentage for Vietnam, only slightly less. It's down from 72 to 71%, and good growth for African cashew kernels. Europe is the biggest destination for African cashew kernels nowadays. Looking east this time to China, and wow, these numbers are unreal. Shipments from Vietnam are up 38% to China in the first 9 months of the year. We have not seen this kind of growth at any point in the past. We'll have a look at that in a little while, but this is really positive. Now we're looking at a trend here. We've talked about good demand in India for Diwali, good demand in Europe, strong shipments to China, and we are looking at really positive times for demand. RCN buyers looking at this, it's a difficult one to read, isn't it? I mean, you're at the time of year when the least volume of raw cashew nuts in the international market is available, although that too is changing. We're looking at buyers. Kickoff prices always in East Africa are high, so buyers are going to wait, I think, and watch the market for a little while, and I think they'd be right to do so. If we look at Cambodia, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Cambodia today. I was there last week, had a marvelous time at a marvelous event, and bringing back some news is that the outlook for the next crop is pretty strong. The crop is looking good. Weather-wise, although the critical flowering period is yet to come. So, interesting trends. We're looking at US tariffs, changes in US tariffs, and we're looking at a situation where we may see an easing of the tariff arrangements between the US, Vietnam, and Cambodia. So interesting trends. There they are on the screen. Some questions are arising from those. So hopefully you can see the trends I've been talking about, but these are giving rise to key questions. And I think we need to start to interrogate some of these really positive trends. And there are some concerns from my point of view. First of all, what's going to happen at the auction in Tanzania? Could Indian buyers, driven by strong demand for Diwali, get pulled into speculative buying in Tanzania? That's a big question, I think. Secondly, and going back to my point about the Diwali demand, is India in a phase of renewed fast growth? We have seen several years, India has been growing for a long, long time, but we've seen several years where demand growth has been less than it had been about 10 years ago when we saw a real growth spurge, growth rates around about 7%. That might be returning. If it does, it changes the balance of supply and demand worldwide very quickly. If that were to coincide with the time when US tariffs on Vietnam, particularly, but they've already been eased on Cambodia, if US tariffs on Vietnam were to be eased, could that again reboot US imports of cashew kernels, which have been down a little bit this year? Well, significantly down this year, in fact. But there's a flip side to that. Changes in tariffs or anticipation of changes in tariffs might also slow down buying. So how long would it take for the US market to switch back? When would the actual changes in tariffs, the reduction in tariffs, take hold? We saw the confusion March, April, May, June this year. Could we see a repeat of that in the coming weeks? I think it's possible. So need to keep an eye on that. Interesting situation. Obviously good for business. If they remove tariffs, that will reduce, or should in theory reduce, prices at the consumer level in the United States, and certainly could lead to a return in confidence. But a note of caution, the economy is most important, and the moves in the US economy will be much more important than any change in tariffs. We saw some positive numbers this week, but obviously there are strange times in the United States with a shutdown of the government for the time being. More questions. Well, can China's import continue to grow at this pace? And as I say, we've got a 10-year average of about 10.9%. And this year we see 38%. Is this a new dawn for cashews in China? Is this about increasing fundamentals demand? Or is it about trade? Is it about turning to cashews because other tree nuts are more difficult? They are more expensive because of import tariffs. Would a trade deal or a new trade deal between China and the United States, would that actually boost the demand in China for other tree nuts and potentially slow down the growth in cashews? I think this is quite an interesting subject. China is the star performer this year. No doubt about that. Will it be next year? So could we see a rebalancing next year? Slower growth in China, the US back to a kind of a normal growth pattern. Interesting question. Time will tell. I've been in Cambodia last week and I want to ask the question, will Cambodia's crop reach 1 million tons in 2026? It's quite likely. That'll be 2 years earlier than expected. Some people would say it has already reached 1 million tons this year. There's nothing special about the figure 1 million other than a little bit of national pride in Cambodia, but it would mark something of a benchmark. And we've seen changes. Looks like it's probably going to hit 1 million tons next year. That's 2 years earlier than was anticipated. And that marks a significant shift. So we have already seen a big shift in supply. Cambodia came to the cashew market 2019, 2020. Production moved up from about 200,000 tons up toward 750 and now over 950,000 tons. That's changed two things. It's changed the amount of cashews available and the timing of them. It's also hugely increased the number of large, high grades, 160s, 180s, 140s, even 120s are available in Cambodia. The market is adjusting to those. China already has to some extent. The rest of the world will find a home for those high level, high quality products. And finally, in a kind of a broader perspective, demand is catching up with production on the evidence of this year. Now, will that continue? At the beginning of 2025, we anticipated that higher prices would impact demand. We were unsure about the US markets because of the import tariff situation. What we've seen is that demand in almost every importing country has increased. We have seen that the higher prices would appear to have had no impact. Or have they? Have they affected the market yet or not? So now we're looking at a situation where start 2025, it looks like a surplus. It is a surplus. 2026 with a good crop, something similar. But the rebalancing, which might have earlier been thought about around about 2029, 2030, that may happen quite a lot sooner if demand in China, if demand returns in the United States, and if demand elsewhere continues to grow. It's a big question, and it will determine the price of cashews for farmers and therefore the trend in the development of our industry over the next 5 years. That's one of the subjects we want to talk about during the GME at the Tanzanian ACA conference. Back to more short-term factors. What about prices? Well, prices are a little bit down on cashew kernels over the past 2 weeks. Quiet market. Vietnamese processors particularly have dropped their prices back 5-10 cents a pound, a little bit weaker at the lower end of the scale in terms of the quality of the processor. Uncertainty returns. The question of tariffs, the good news on tariffs, probably for Vietnam, hasn't yet impacted the market. But the fact that buyers are out, despite strong demand signals, buyers are watching. Prices have drifted down a lot, a little rather. Less obvious is in Africa, where prices seem to remain relatively steady, good demand. Most people are very well sold. High quality kernels from Tanzania, making good prices in the markets in Europe and in the Middle East. Looks like relative stability for the time being, at least. Good buying demand, just a little bit below these levels. If you backed off by about 10 cents a pound, I think you'd find a lot of buyers would come into the market. So that sets the floor for the time being. What about RCN? Well, again, prices haven't moved a lot, probably because there hasn't been a lot of trade. People are looking at the auction in Tanzania starting on Friday. They're noticing last year a lot of Indian buyers got pulled into some short-term speculations. Prices started very high and they fell, as I'll show you later. Indian buyers have been reselling to Vietnam. Will they need to replace that product or were they just rebalancing their stocks? Not entirely sure. We'll need to see the reaction once the impact of good demand over Diwali becomes clear. But whatever about re-exports from India, imports to both India and Vietnam this year are very strong. So you've got very strong imports, but you've also got very strong kernels demand. We're going to be looking at, according to the forecasts, and this material is not in the warehouses yet, but according to the forecasts, we could be looking at an additional 200,000 tons in East Africa. It wouldn't entirely be surprising. When you get growth in cashews, it tends to be multi-year. So you get 1, 2, 3, 4 years of growth before it slows down again. We saw that in Cambodia. We're probably seeing it in East Africa too. But it is coming to the market a little bit later. So the Tanzanian auction last year started on the 11th of October. This year it's the 31st of October. That brings its own complications. That means that product which might have been expected to be in India, for example, in December, probably won't make it until the very end of the month. And that changes the dynamic a little bit. Is it worth buying it if it's going to arrive later? That'll be a big question for buyers. It'll depend on the price that the auction works at too. If we look at trade, so I wanted to have a quick look at the import figures for India and for Vietnam. And as you can see on the screen, to the end of September, India's imports are really strong, 21% up on last year for the same period. A little bit lower than the all-time high. 2022 was the all-time high, so about 6% lower than the all-time high, and a slight adjustment for the re-export. I'm not entirely sure how much is being re-exported. I've hit on a figure of around about 100,000 tons. Might be a little bit overstated. Time will show. Looking at Vietnam in the same way, of course, we got figures up to the middle of October. These are really strong figures, very strong compared to last year, up 10% and just 2% below the all-time high of 2023. Now, why does 2022 for India or 2023 matter from a comparison point of view? In both cases, there was a significant carryout of raw cashew nut stock, which impacted purchasing in the early part of the Northern Hemisphere season, slowed it down, of course. So I thought, let's have a look at India. Let's see if we can make a little bit of sense of India. And you've seen me doing this before if you've been with us before. And what I tried to do is I tried to look at each of the elements of the market and try to work out what additional purchases might be needed to get to a typical closing stock. So the factors are strong demand in India. There is a slight upward revision of the crop in my book. Some may argue on that one, but I've revised my version up to 780,000 tons. There's a lot of info behind that, which I won't go into if you don't mind. Imports very strong, 1.15 million tons, and a little bit of a re-export to Vietnam. So if we look at it, I've slightly increased domestic demand. So here's domestic demand on the left-hand side of the chart expressed in raw cashew nut terms. Export of kernels, not much change there. Imports, well, we know that figure. So this is 1.15 million tons, as we've just seen. Crop, I'm putting in 780,000 tons. It's not a big number difference, whatever way you look at it. In September, I had a figure of 740, I think it was, up to 780. Opening stock hasn't changed. The re-export has come in. I'm putting in 100,000 tons of stock re-exported. So that would give us a closing stock of about 280,000 tons. That's more because of the higher imports, slightly higher crop, despite the re-export. And I think the demand for January to March. So if we're saying that the demand for November and December is in the form of kernels, it's in factories, it's work in progress. Then we look at January to March. Why January to March? Because the Indian crop will start in March. That's about 450,000 tons. So if you take the stock, if you take the demand, India needs to import only an additional 170,000 tons. It's not a lot by the standards of this time of year. So what this is telling us is that overall, India doesn't need to buy large volumes of RCN to finish with a reasonable closing stock. It could, though, finish with a situation of overstocking, as was seen in particularly 2022. Or last year we saw it wasn't that it was unsold, it was just that it was very high cost. So there are problems in this, or potentially problems in this, which could be costly. If India were to import the same volume of raw cashew nuts between October and February as it did between October and February of last year, then the stocks would head up toward 450,000 tons. That's assuming good, strong demand. That is too much. And that would put us in a position where importers, traders, and processors would probably be holding too much raw material. If that happens, probably they come to the market in West Africa a little bit slower in the early part of next year. So that's just something to bear in mind. Watch the imports, see how India's final figure pans out. 1.15 at this stage could easily translate into 1.35 or 1.45 million tons. We could be looking at a record import level into India. That could translate into some early interest in the auction in Tanzania, because Indian buyers do like Tanzanian raw cashew nuts. They're known for their quality, they're known for their processing characteristics, but that could slow down very quickly. So we'll have a little look later on when we come to the production side. We'll have a look at the situation in Tanzania and what happened last year to see if there's any clues in that. But really what we're saying here is, does India need to push in the Tanzanian auction? So a number of factors are at play there. The supply and demand in India, the lateness of the opening of the auction, the need for high quality, all of these factors are playing in. It's going to be very interesting over the next few weeks to see how that works. Elsewhere, let's have a look at trade elsewhere. Let's have a look at some of the kernels figures. January to August in the European Union, 124,000 plus tons. That's up 7.8% versus last year, 17% better than 2023 and higher than the 10-year growth. So it looks like in the European Union, positive demand trends, positive demand trends in convenience, in plant-based foods, demand trends in growing markets in the Eastern European Union are all contributing to growth. Europeans love cashews, simple as that, and they are expressing that year on year by buying more of them. If we look in the US, mainly I think because of two things. One is the huge import last year to build inventories in defense against tariffs, or perhaps to take advantage of the situation, is one thing. We know that there were high imports last year and that the imports exceeded the growth in consumer demand. We also know that consumer demand was quite positive last year. Rebalancing this year, overall imports into the United States down by 14.5% on 2024, which is not a surprise. Higher price, big import last year. But if we look at 2023, still 12% lower. So there is a significant impact of tariffs now. That might be market confidence. It might be consumer demand. We'll see. We'll know in the next few weeks as we come into the really peak season in the United States ahead of the Thanksgiving festival and then ahead of the Christmas and New Year season. The imports, by the way, include processed kernels. If you look simply at natural kernels, that figure is up, well, it's down by about 28%. So if you were looking simply at natural kernels, you'll see a much lower figure. What I do is I include the bulk packed processed, that means roasted mainly, also imported into the United States. And this is a segment that's growing quickly. So Vietnamese processors and packers are processing, adding more value and selling that to the United States. And that is working really well. If we look in China, well, I've mentioned it already. These numbers are, way, way up there. 38% up on last year, 78% up on 2023. Note of caution, we have seen in the past 1 or 2 years of really fast growth in the market in China in terms of imports of cashew kernels, and then that has slowed down afterwards. So for some reason, the market goes through growth spurts, then calms down, another one. This may be different. We don't know that. But what we do know is that in the January to September period, China has imported much greater quantities from Vietnam. And there is a chance that by the end of the year, China could be the largest importer. Now, it's still unlikely. It still looks likely to me that the European Union will be the largest importer, followed by the United States. The figures on the screen, China's Jan, September, US is Jan, July, EU is January, August. So they're not directly comparable. And finally, West Asia. So I've a kind of defined a market. It's West Asia, North Africa. So this is the Gulf countries. It is the countries of North Africa. So this would include countries like Egypt, Morocco, which have become significant importers of cashew nuts, as well as the more typical countries, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and increasingly Iraq is finding its way into the trade stats. So really strong growth there, consistent over the last 2 years. This looks like something really fundamental to me. The market is nowhere near saturation. The market is nowhere near a point where you would say it's mature in terms of its consumption. And I think we can look forward to increased demand from those markets. I think it's also notable, although India does still play a significant part in those markets, they do like larger kernels, they like light color kernels. Vietnam has, like everywhere else, taken over and dominates that market. That's something we wouldn't have expected looking back 5 or 6 years. So, key trade figures then, in summary, looking back at them: China, 38% growth this year. Look how far ahead it is of the 10-year average. Unlikely to continue at that speed, but there's something that is likely, and growth is likely to continue. European Union, just ahead of the 10-year average this year. That's positive too for such a mature market. The US, we've talked about. The US has been growing slowly for a long time. This year, it's severely knocked back for the reasons I've talked about. And again, West Asia, North Africa, again, very high growth. So really, the long-term growth rates are being blown away in 2015. We got to ask the question, how much have the higher prices been passed on? Don't forget, prices are up by more than 30% this year compared to the early part of last year. Have these impacted? Have they yet to be passed on? And in the case of China and West Asia, how influential are trade tariffs? So trade tariffs on other tree nuts, mainly imported from the United States, almonds and pistachios, for example, compared to cashews, which come from countries that, generally speaking, have no trade tariffs on them. So demand looks good, looks very good. Some question marks around it. I think we're looking at continued growth next year, probably not at this pace in China or in West Asia, but nonetheless, growth. If there is an adjustment on tariffs, we could see something of a return to form in the United States too. Demand looks positive. Let's have a look at the production side then. So production at this time of year is really all about Southern Hemisphere. But I'm going to start with something else. I'm going to start with Cambodia. I was in Cambodia last week at the first National Cashew Forum, an event that was organized by the EU-German CapSafe project, a project under GIZ management, and the Ministry of Commerce, amongst others. There were 385 delegates at this event. You can see some of the photos on the screen. We had an exhibition of products, we had workshops, we had presentations, we had policy discussions, we had exhibitors of services mainly, from all around the world. Excellent discussion, very positive. It's really interesting in Cambodia. I was coming from the airport in a taxi, and a young man was driving. He asked me what I was doing in Cambodia. I told him, and he said, "Oh, my parents have a cashew farm in Kampong Tom. They've got 4 hectares." I said, "That's interesting." And he said, "Yeah, they get 2 tons per hectare." Wow, I thought, that's incredible. And he went on to tell me about why they get 2 tons per hectare, what the variety is. And it just put into perspective for me how important cashews have become for agriculture in Cambodia and the progress that's been made. Where next? Well, let's have a look at some of the market factors that were reported in the course of those few days last week. This year, 940,000 tons exported, about 20,000 tons processed. So that's a 960,000 tons, probably a little bit more product in the hands of traders, still not in the figures. 2026 growing conditions so far favorable. Um, some rains, but no damage, according to the general discussion. I did talk to a lot of people on this one. Flowering will be November, end of November into December. That, of course, is a critical period. The impact of climate change in Cambodia has been greater extremes. So, really heavy rain at times, really hot temperatures, long periods of dry weather, and that can impact during flowering, of course. And so that remains to be seen. Last year, there was an impact, I'm told, of the weather conditions. And someone actually tells me that the crop would have been bigger if the weather had been a little bit better. So I think we can probably expect a crop that will exceed 1 million tons, assuming the next 6 to 8 weeks go well. So another big crop in Cambodia, and it has different impacts. It has obviously adds more product to the market, but it also adds it earlier. So Vietnamese processors tend to buy that earlier, and therefore they need more cash earlier in the year. The quality of the nuts is good. They are large, as you probably know. They're light color. They roast well. Um, it's a high quality product added into the market, and I'm wondering, are we seeing some of that in the narrower premiums for some of the large nuts? So 180s, despite a short term tightness in the market, have narrowed in against 320s historically, so have 240s. And this is a marketing story waiting to be made. There is a good opportunity to market large, high quality cashew nuts from Cambodia. It needs a market to be developed. Processing development right now is mostly at project stage. So there are about 40 processors. Most of them are small. There are some bigger ones. Um, some of the factories are struggling with issues, as everywhere. Working capital, if you're an African processor, you might be familiar with that problem. And there are some other difficulties. The government is attempting to develop a cashew park. That's at very early stages. And there are some concerns about the future of that and the level of investment in that, given elsewhere cashew parks have not had a particularly good history, as we know. But to go back to production, quick look. So here's our chart. Remarkable 28% per annum growth over 10 years, slowed in the last 4 or 5 years. Growth now around about 4%. If we project that forward, we would have expected, so this is a projection done earlier on this year, we would have expected to hit 1 million tons sometime 2027. The red is the optimistic forecast, the blue is the just putting the current trend as at that time, January 25, forward. But what we see is that estimates now probably suggest 1 to 2 years earlier, so maybe 2026, we will see a greater than 1 million ton crop. I think possibly it slows there after we've seen growth has slowed in recent years. There is an impact. Cambodia is vulnerable to climate change, and cashew farmers are no different to other farmers. They too are vulnerable. But we have to acknowledge this has never happened anywhere before at this kind of pace, and it may never happen again. So watch the weather. If you're looking for clues on next year, watch the weather in Cambodia over the next 6 to 8 weeks during the critical harvest period. And we can expect volatile weather conditions given the experience of recent years, but they may or may not impact the final production figure as we saw in 2025. So let's go back east and have a look at Tanzania. Let's have a look at the trend. So if we take last year's crop and we plug in numbers from the Cashew Board of Tanzania, 528,000 tons for last year. I'll be honest, I'm struggling to find where that went. My figure's a little bit lower than that. My figure is based not on actual farm production, but it's based on trade, disappearance, export, processing. What we can say for sure is that the growth has been extraordinary in last year and is as expected this year. So Tanzania has come along, successfully managed growth. This year, the Cashew Board is forecasting a 700,000 ton crop. Trade sources, they agree it's big, but they don't see that number as the real number. They think maybe somewhere between 560,000 tons and 575,000 tons. That's a huge growth. That is a phenomenal performance by the farmers of Tanzania. So far, arrivals are slow. The crop appears to be late. There is some discussion that the weather may have not only delayed it, but damaged it, but that is not yet clear. The auction will start on the 31st of October, about 20 days later. I haven't been able to see the catalogue online so far. It may be there today. Two things. First of all, a late crop does not mean that there's a problem with the crop. We've seen that in Cambodia where the crop was late, but it was a very good crop. Um, nor does it mean that there isn't a problem with the crop. So it does, again, need to be watched closely. And Tanzania now has a slightly different role. So go from being a supplier during a period of low production of high quality cashew nuts during that period of low production. It's now evolving into a much more important producer of cashew nuts in terms of the overall supply and demand balance. It has the auction system in place that was upgraded last year. Now it's part of the Tanzanian Mercantile Exchange. It will start on Friday. We'll have a look at what happened during the auction last year. And it's an interesting story. So what you've got on this, it looks a bit complex. I know that. It's just a way of measuring. If it's blue, it's Tanzanian shillings. If it's red, it's US dollars. That's the first thing. If it's lighter color, or if it's on the left, it's the low. The dark blue is the high bid. So you can see here that in the initial auctions, the high bids exceeded 4,000 shillings and the low bids were around about 3,800. Stepping back from it, you can see that there was about a 27.5% decline in prices in the course of the whole period of the auctions from the 11th of October through to the 12th of January. It's an interesting situation. Tanzania, as a producer of cashew nuts, does not set the world market price, only partially influences it because of timing and scale, but it lives in it like we all do. So setting prices is quite difficult. So early last year, we had a number of buyers. There weren't huge volumes sold early on, but we had a number of buyers come in, pay some very big prices. And maybe they live to regret that. Maybe they resold or made some money out of it. We can't be sure. But what we do know is that the prices fell away sharply. Now, towards the end, there is an influence of some of the later quality material coming to market. That's also a factor here. But if you look from over $2,100 in the beginning of the season on a cost and freight. So cost and freight means all taxes paid, loaded, everyone's paid, it's insured, it's financed, and it's basically cost and freight South India or cost and freight Vietnam on average. If we look at it, remarkable volatility from $2,100 per ton all the way down to just over $1,400. In fact, broke $1,400 at one stage in December. So huge volatility. And this is not healthy if you're in this market, of course. There's a question. Now, if I were a trader, I might go into the market early and I might buy a few lots at high prices in order to encourage my customers. and then come back later for more at lower prices and work it that way. Auction systems are open to manipulation. And I don't mean a manipulation by um, falsehood. I mean a manipulation simply by buying small volumes at high prices to begin with. So this year, what's different? We have a large crop, even though it may be a little bit lower than the original forecasts. We have a late start. Now, it could be, this may explain why the product is coming slowly. So processors have been buying, but it's been a struggle for them because less product is coming to the market. So farmers may be holding out, waiting to see how the auction starts. Now, in this case, it kind of draws into perspective the policy. If you have a policy that processors can access the farm gate before the auction, it only helps if there's an incentive for farmers to sell to them. If you don't know what the auction price is, they may wait. Now, that could be in some years that farmers get lower prices, and in some years they get higher prices. But it doesn't do an awful lot to support processing in the country. What it does is it brings processing into the auction speculation. Last year, we saw a really slow start. In the first week, only about 3,800 tonnes sold at big prices, mind you, over 4,000 shillings, over $2,000. I remember looking at this and being really surprised and wondering how anyone could make sense of that in terms of turning it into money. It took about 7 weeks, according to the Cashew Board of Tanzania, to sell 262,000 tonnes, or about half the crop, let's say. Those 7 weeks were pretty active, and after those 7 weeks, prices started to fall away. This year, we've got a different supply and demand scenario. We have, firstly, India, as we've seen, is better covered on raw cashew nuts. Vietnam has imported a lot more cashew nuts this year, raw cashew nuts this year. Okay, it is true, exports have also been much higher, but on the balance, and this has got to be a question, isn't it, for Vietnam as time goes on? I mean, this balance of trade, the balance of trade between import of raw cashew nuts and export of kernels is getting narrower and narrower. How can you increase that? Back to Tanzania. So we are seeing a different scenario. Vietnam, better covered. India, much better covered. Strong demand. This needs to be balanced. I think also we look at currency. So the US dollar is a lot weaker than it has been. There's about 10% difference in the Tanzanian shilling to the US dollar. So what people can pay in shillings is different. And that's an exchange rate factor. All in all, I would be really surprised if the auction starts at anywhere near the opening prices of last year. It just doesn't make sense in the market. You might say it didn't make sense last year either, and that's true. I couldn't disagree with that. Interesting times ahead. We're going to talk about this in the coming weeks, and it'll be very interesting to see what happens from Friday onwards as the auction at the Tanzanian Mercantile Exchange kicks off. What about Mozambique, Tanzania's neighbor to the south and another cashew powerhouse in East Africa? Harvest has started in the northern areas, and it kind of moves south through the country. So it starts in October in the north, followed by more central areas, and then finally December in the south. Official season is starting this week. The minimum farm gate price is 45 metacal per kilo. That's unchanged from last year. It is a little bit higher because of the exchange rate change. That's about $715. We're looking at generally 46, 47 pounds, although some people will say it's lower. Doesn't look too expensive, really. It looks about right. Official estimate of the crop now is around about 200,000 tons. That hasn't changed a lot. It has been reduced. But trade estimates of that, and if you were with us the last time, you'll have seen we do a little bit of analysis on that. Trade estimates would have that anywhere from 50 to 75,000 tons less, and some people's estimates are even lower than that. So, Their estimates are lower, not saying that the crop is in any way in trouble. What they're saying is that the counting of the crop is over optimistic. The way it's done is what they're talking about. We hear offers in the market 14.50, maybe a little more, cost and freight. I mean, if we compare that back to the farm gate, looks high. There is an 18% export tax, but even so, 14.25 plus looks expensive compared to the farm gate price. Now, we don't know if the farm gate price may kick off much higher. Quite difficult to see any reason for that. For now, exports are prohibited until the processors, those that are operating, have bought what they need. So in Mozambique, there is a pretty good system to protect processors. Possibly the weakness of the system is that, to a large extent, the same people were processors as were exporters of raw cashew nuts, and that robbed the system of a little bit of efficiency. We have seen, as we talked about 2 weeks ago, a lot of pressure on processing in Mozambique, and it has. There are signs of recovery now, and there are some great projects working, but still difficult times, I think, for processors in Mozambique, and many have resorted to the Burma kernels as the answer to their problem, but that's going to be taxed from 2026. If you remember, 4 weeks ago, we had the Lucia Roque from the IAM, and she explained that to us. Good news in the media. This week, the government announced a major investment plan for the cashew sector. Investment plans all around the world make great reading. Implementation is the issue. That's an issue in Cambodia. That was a big discussion last week. It's an issue elsewhere. It's an issue in Ghana. It's an issue in Tanzania. Let's see how it pans out. But if it works, it could have a major impact. And to Brazil, so we looking again at the Brazilian estimates of the crop. Latest estimate, slightly bigger than last year. The latest estimate is September. So this is an official, the IGBE, the official Brazilian statistical agency. This is what they estimate for the crop. They're usually pretty right. Just draw your attention to yields in Brazil. 312 kilos per hectare on average, 328. It's a different cashew growing system. In Cambodia, the average is 1.43 tons per hectare. We know in West Africa, it's somewhere around about 400 kilos. So Brazil is lower. But a pretty much similar to last year crop. All that adds up to, in terms of the Southern Hemisphere, is, we've seen growth, 2024, 2023. We're going to see more growth, I think. Depending on who you talk to, essentially the differences between official estimates and trade estimates. The long-term growth rate is between 4.5% and 6%. In the last 5 years, it's grown at about 8.5%. So this year, calculated, mid-range estimates, about 975,000 tons raw cashew nuts coming to the market. It started in Brazil, it started in Mozambique, it started in Tanzania and Indonesia, and it will finish sometime mid-January. Overall, very positive. It's slightly rebalanced the position of the Southern Hemisphere in the market. So you're looking at about 17% of the world's crop. That got down to as low as 13% a few years back. Now, significant recovery, growth in East Africa, something of a recovery in Brazil, steady growth in Indonesia. It's a lot more raw cashews coming to the market from September to January than we've seen in the last decade. Not since Brazil was producing 450,000 tons have we seen figures like this. It'll be interesting to see how the market copes with it. So our last focus today is policy and regulation. I like to update this because two reasons really. One, there are quite a few changes from time to time, but wow, is there a lot of talk as well. And a lot of the talk is propaganda. It's people trying to influence politicians and regulators. Let's have a look at a few of the latest stories. Here's your picture of Africa and Ivory Coast. The subsidy, the famous subsidy, slow payment of the subsidy this year causes cash flow problems for processors who were expecting it. Some may never have included it in their cash flow, others were relying on it. In Nigeria, there is it's kind of calmed down now, but there is a big push for export controls on raw cashew nuts, um, which naturally is upsetting farmers who've done a pretty good job in increasing production and quality in Nigeria. And this call for an export ban, and some people have called for an export ban, surprising to me because the evidence from elsewhere, from Benin, from Kenya, even short term from Cote d'Ivoire and from Burkina Faso in the last couple of years, although they were only short term bans, it's brought nothing but trouble. It's actually impacted processing negatively. Um, I personally don't get it. I don't see how anyone can see a benefit in reorganizing the sector in this way, except for some people's bottom line. I can't see any overall sector benefit. So we'll see how that plays out. I'd be surprised if the Nigerian government were to introduce such a ban. In Ghana, not a great deal of change, but a great deal of frustration from actors, from some investors, some processors who want to see policy, which is in place, implemented a little bit more quickly. And they would like to see some of the promised initiatives for processors in place. And Ghana, Ghana 10 years ago, Ghana was number one destination for prospective cashew investment in West Africa. It never happened. One large factory, and that was it. Most of the investment of the period 2017 through to 2024 was in Cote d'Ivoire. Ghana was left behind, and people are now interested again in Ghana, and they're looking for some assistance. They're looking for some support. Actually, what they're looking for more than anything is some certainty on how the sector will be regulated. If we look in Benin, there is a timely reassessment of the supply chain. That report may be already available. I haven't seen it, but there is a reassessment of how the supply chain has worked, the impact of the ban, and more or less, I don't think they're going to change the ban, but I think they are looking to better organize the relationship between farmers, cooperatives, traders, and processors to try and ensure that more product is processed, which was the objective of the ban in the first place, but hasn't really worked out. So there is, as we look at policy, and we're probably looking at a period starting December onwards where regulators will reassess their policies and decide on their regulatory measures for 2026. And I think we're seeing slow progress on what matters. I think that the processors, and this is maybe global, are struggling with matching RCN costs with kernels prices for profitable processing. That's to do with market volatility. It's not to do just with the price of RCN, but it is to do with the cost of moving it to market. Market volatility is a major issue. Policy should not contribute to market volatility, but as we've seen in recent years, it does. Managing risk can be managed by forward contracting. But if you're not in a position where buyers are going to trust you, it's going to be very difficult to make forward contracts. Many processors are dependent on distant supply chains. Vietnam imports about 60% of its raw cashew nuts from Africa. Distant supply chain, similarly for India. If we look at the cost of the shipment of raw material between freight, finance, insurance, taxation, the cost of shipment of raw material has skyrocketed in recent years. And that too is challenging. It reduces margins, it increases volatility, and it creates a great deal of uncertainty. I think there's also an aspect, and this is a big thing that's sometimes not thought about enough. It is challenging to manage a wide range of raw material. People buy cashews because of their taste, because of their appearance, because of their quality. The quality of cashews in most of the world has declined hugely in the last 20 years. At some point in time, buyers will start to look at that. So managing a wide range of raw material is challenging. This is pointing more and more towards origin-based processing, whatever country it's in, but origin-based processing making more sense. Last issue, and it's an issue again that needs to be mentioned over and over again. It came up in Cambodia last week. It comes up every time we talk about cashews. In African countries, access to working capital, and we're looking at greater and greater need for more working capital simply because production is getting bigger, the market is getting bigger, and prices have gone up. So you need more money if you need to buy more raw cashew nuts, and that money appears to only be generated from the same sources, increasing their influence in the market with few outside sources and largely the absence of cashew kernels buyers in funding. It's creating challenging conditions. So policy and its impact on processors is a key factor which needs serious consideration, not only in African countries, but throughout the cashew producing countries, in my view. Outlook for the coming couple of weeks, I think RCN stocks probably adequate. The supply on paper exceeds demand, but that does not mean prices will fall. In fact, they probably will not. I think the kernels sentiment is weaker. Prices are in a range. I don't think they're going to break out of that range, but I think they might head towards the bottom end of that range. So that means a 310 to 315, 320. Buyers are waiting for that. They're waiting to cover. I think in this environment, speculation at the Tanzanian auction could be dangerous. Paying too much money now for raw nuts, whatever the quality, could be difficult. On the other hand, you could say to me, don't worry about that, Jim, because cashew kernels demand is breaking records, and that's true. The questions then we're left with, can that cashew kernel demand continue its growth? And as a kind of a subtext to that, will the easing of tariff burdens on prices boost US imports? And so imagine a scenario where China sticks to form, continues to grow, the European Union, similar situation, West Asia, North Africa continues to grow, and the US returns to growth. That would be a very positive scenario for demand in 2026. But for now, we're just left with the question. That's it from me. Thanks very much indeed. Don't forget, you can find all of these webinars online. There's 90 of them now. Don't even think about looking at them all, but you can also go quickly through them and pick out the topics that are interesting. If anyone ever is looking for a particular topic, drop me a line. I'll be more than happy to guide you toward it. And let's go back to Stella and see if there are any questions or comments. Stella.
Thank you very much, Jim. Yes, we have a couple of questions. How can actors counter the market volatility? This question was picked from our Facebook Live.
Be informed, know your market, know your customer, know your market. That's the first basic thing of managing volatility. Does the volatility matter to your customer? What does it